not everybody knows. Was the older generation a little bit embarrassed that these kids just jumped out here, went to jail, opened these doors, and that was it a sheepish support, or was like those are our young people?
Personally, I think that the older generation was slower. Now, I have to say that some of them had done lots of things in their own way and in their own right. But I do think the student movement was a little more active and determined not to quit, to move on. And I think, given that enthusiasm, um, the older generation, especially the ministers, were full-fledged on board in terms of encouraging and participating. Would I say that I think they led us initially? If so, not that I was as aware of, I would say we led them.
Let's talk about some of the other protests. There were places that just had overt racism, and that I'm thinking of Lester Maddox, who ended up becoming governor with his pickrick and his hatchets, and the Heart of Atlanta motel. Can you tell me what was the scenario behind that allowed these people to be so blatant?
People like Lester Maddox, in my opinion, and there were many, were just hardcore racist. Just as we or I was committed to equality and equality of opportunity, I think their generations or whatever it was that drove them made them hardcore that the races shall never mix, not even at a restaurant. So I think that was the motivation. And I unfortunately think they taught that to their children. And that's why we have such entrenched racism in the United States, in Atlanta. And you had people, governors and others, mayors and so forth, who were just determined there will not be any mixing in any way in the schools, in any other way. And the laws that these people put on the books and supported and perpetuated, I think speaks to their deep-seated racism.
No. Let's talk once more about the economic boycott. That was a masterful organization, and it asked a lot of people. Give back your credit cards. Give back the one thing that black people usually don't get in the first place, and give it back at a place that everybody loved. Talk about the importance of riches and the importance of that boycott.
Riches, as you know, was definitely a giant, I would say, in the city of Atlanta as a department store. And all of us and our parents and other relatives went there for everything. I guess Sears was among those two, Davidson's, of course. But they were just as adamant about their restaurants. And the only thing that black people had to offer to them was green, and that was money. Other than that, they too held fast for a while in terms of not allowing change in practices there. I think it was Lonnie and others who negotiated with Mr. Rich, and I think at that point I had graduated from college and moved on, so I was not a part of that, even though I was a part of the group that would march out in front of it or go sit in there if necessary. So that's about what I could say about that. I think it was a milestone when they finally, as such a hardcore group, changed, and I think that made some difference, a significant difference in the city of Atlanta to all the people. And I think it also became something that the white people could take notice of and began to question as well.
You know, one of the things that is unique to you is the fact that you did go to the East Coast. Boston has its own particular set of hierarchy there, but As a member of the Atlanta student movement, an original member, did you have to explain things to people who weren't from Atlanta, both black and white?
I left and I left Atlanta and took a teaching job in Boston. Um, yes, I was constantly asked about being a Southerner and about conditions in the South. And if people knew of my participation, they had to get to know me pretty well to know. Um, I was often asked to talk about that. But what struck me going from Atlanta to Boston was how deep racism was in the United States of America. I was, if they saw me as some kind of phenomenon, I saw everything there in the same way. I was just in utter amazement and shock. I looked for an apartment just for the summer, and I had some amazing experiences trying to find a place to live. The first summer that I was in Boston teaching, always turned away with, we just rented it. So those were the kinds of things I thought you only experience in the South. Was I so wrong? And that as I continued to travel in other places, I found it similar to the experience in Boston. And I used to say to people as they would talk to me as a Southerner, I would say that I see the racism as one blatant, one overt, and the other totally the opposite. It's still there, but it's insidious. It's not overt, but it's just about as thick.
I find, and of course, I'm not from the South, and I agree with you 1,000%. Do you think the Atlanta student movement made a difference in the rest of the country, or did you not get your due and not enough of those stories came out?
I think the Atlanta student movement made an amazing difference in Atlanta. And I think it also made an amazing difference throughout the country. And to this day, people are still talking about what the students did. I don't think they always give the students and the movement its due. I will say that. I think they might talk to a few people who have become pretty well known through the movement. But I definitely think it was a significant step, a significant movement in the United States. I think it had a significant influence, as you asked me earlier about our elders, our ministers. I think it definitely touched them. There were some of those who I think were probably deep down as rebel, if you want, as I may, sometimes my friends would say I must have been, but they didn't act on it. I think the movement gave them the impetus to move forward and speak out. Now, that isn't to say there weren't those who were already doing many things and significant things, but I do think it allowed them. If these young people can do this and risk their lives, and I do emphasize that we did risk our lives, then they surely could step forward too as our elders and leaders.
Okay. I want to go back. Tell me about the numbers of people that participated in some of these marches. I know the one going to the Capitol was like 2,000 people. I know the one at Hurt Plaza was big. What about, I know that you went to several places at one time. You might have somebody at Union Station and somebody at Riches and somebody here. About how many students were sent in various places?
Well, what happened, to my knowledge, is that each of these places that we sat in at in 1960, there was a team of people who scoped it out, if you will, to see what was going on in these restaurants at the particular time of the day, about how many people were there, and about how many people could be accommodated to sit. And so that's how it was determined as to how many do we need to go to Union Station. I think there were 14 or so of us from Spelman, but there were about 60 or more students from the AU Center. That's my recollection. It could be wrong. That was at the sit-in, the massive sit-in at the time, which I say started all of this. I participated in marches where I couldn't see the end of the line. around even the city. So I remember a march going up Hunter Street at the time. Uh, there were shorter marches sometimes and with maybe 100 people, but sometimes they were really, really large. And as I said, you could look back, and I was not necessarily at the beginning of the line, but you could look back and you would see so many students. And there were just so many who participated that people have no idea about.
Wow, wow. I'm going to segue topics, and of course, we lost one of the leaders of the student movement, Julian Bond. Where did you meet him, and what do you remember about him?
Well, he was in the same class as I. He was at Morehouse, and we were in the same class. So I saw him a lot on campus. I used to sit next to his sister Jane in chapel at Spelman. Julian was really memorable to me. I saw him often. We talked often. My best memories of Julian are him walking around with his yellow pad, taking notes for the Atlanta Inquirer. I used to see him doing that quite often. Wherever I went, Julian almost always had this yellow pad and a pencil and was writing something or some story or something that he was doing for or writing for the Inquirer. So to me, he was a true journalist, even though he was a student. He was an excellent writer. He was an excellent speaker and someone that I think many of us admired as a fellow student. So I have very fond and deep memories of Julian all the time, as well as his family in general.
And that's just it. His whole family was kind of immersed in the Atlanta University culture. Do you think that singled him out to lead this movement, or in any way put any pressure on him?
Absolutely not. I think it was the person, Julian Bond. There may have been, since I wasn't privy to his at home, I imagine his father and parents talked a lot about education and the significance of education. In fact, I'm pretty sure of that. And that happened in lots of homes. But I think it was his inner core, his inner person, who he was and who he became, and his own experiences that pushed him to the forefront. I guess I can't even say where I think his interest in politics began, but I was very happy that he got into that, and I think he did a great job, and continued throughout his life to make significant improvements and speeches and differences. I think he had quite an impact on what went on in the United States and had lots to say that we shall all remember forever.
That's excellent. Those are the things that I wanted to talk to you about. See, I knew you had great stories. Okay.
Thank
Have I
you.
missed anything?
I can't think of anything that you've missed. I mean, there's so much to all of this, and so many memories. And at my age now, we're forgetting. But
Give me a memory that's off the wall, that just kind of pops into your head, that may or may not be specifically tied to a protest or something like that. You were a young woman then in college, and you were doing something earth-shaking.
well, one of my real memories is how busy I was and keeping these various activities, if you will, together. Another was the big decision I had to make at the time of the second jailing, going to jail. I participated in planning and so forth, but at that time I said to myself, you've worked, so you need to graduate. And so at that time I chose not to. But for a most significant memory, I remember being in the courthouse when the judge was telling us how we would be criminals forever. And I remember him sending home Jeff Begaze, who was 15, and an early admission student, and barring him from Atlanta. So he had to withdraw from Morehouse and go back to Alabama, and I never forgot that. And to this day, that probably from my student movement activities stood out.
That's it. What was it like to hear MLK's dream speech? He handed this to me
Let her look at.
50 years ago, the March on Washington.
I was interviewed and asked about that, about being present at 1963 at the March on Washington. As I said in that interview, that was an incredible experience, just being there, and to hear him, to hear all of the others who spoke up from that stage. And as I said then, the sea of people there from all walks of life, that's an experience that stands in front of my eyes as I talk to you and look at you now. And I just remember, I mean, I was body to body with people I didn't know, but that was just an amazing experience. Martin Luther King was always, as I said, I think quite early in this interview, an inspiration to the students and to the movement. And for the organizers of the March on Washington, and to hear all of them was another phenomenal experience for me.
Thank you so much. And that's one that we'll follow up on a different topic. Thank you.